But industry had learned a lot. When we look back on the 1992 Earth Summit Conference, my friend Jim McNeil, who was the Secretary General of the Brundtland Commission, says, you know, we signed the treaties, but it was where the Carbon Club got formed. And we started having to fight big coal and big oil and all the lies, and their use of focus groups, their sophistication, their ability to figure out what will drive US and consumers and citizens away from their global responsibility to go first. So they came up with this argument. It's not fair. Where are China and India? It's not fair. So these issues have been around and plagued us, and now we're facing a global negotiation that must replace the first phase of Kyoto, which only makes sense to extend all the negotiated elements of how you account for CO2, how you move forward, what will work. And the developing countries, having just watched the industrialized world take on targets under Kyoto, and although, and this is important, most of the industrialized countries that took on targets under Kyoto have met their targets. Most of those nations that signed and ratified, including the European Union, have more than met their targets. Canada stands as the only nation on earth that signed and ratified Kyoto that has publicly repudiated its targets, breaking with an international, legally binding treaty. And it's a shameful thing, and I know how our youth feel at these international negotiations, that we have been the only nation that has actually chosen to violate our international binding agreements. But at the same time, the problem was the US never ratified Kyoto, so George Bush led them in the other direction. Canada and the US have ramped up our emissions ever since the Kyoto Protocol negotiations. And the rest of the world, Brazil and China, have certainly grown in their emissions, but they're saying, what about the equity? What about the fact that you accepted in 1997 that industrialized countries must go first? Because we have the technology as industrialized countries, because we have the historical legacy of emissions that have already changed the chemistry of the atmosphere, and because those nations that will be most impacted, that will see the greatest loss of life, the greatest threats to their own domestic security, are those nations in the developing world who had the very least to do with creating the problem. So the principles from Kyoto going forward make sense, and as we look towards Copenhagen, we had already agreed to much of this. We'd agreed to it in 2005 in Montreal at COP11. We'd agreed to it in Bali. And last year in Poznan in Poland, we saw other governments prepared to move forward to say we must see emissions reductions in the next phase. Meanwhile, the deadlines of negotiations, as Andrew said, they're not all about politics and when we have said in different agreements we must move forward. They're fundamentally about the chemistry of the atmosphere and the fact there's no room left for more CO2 emissions. We know that the scientific information on the climate crisis is very solid. It's only more robust since 1988. It's clear and compelling. The people who are making things up about sunspots, and I think Andrew's covered this well enough that I can leave it alone, that you'll accept the idea that these people are playing a role that is, on an intergenerational scale, unspeakably criminal. They would sell out our children and our grandchildren's future for their short-term profits. Now, we know the atmosphere is not interested in negotiating with humanity. There are some rock-solid realities out there in terms of how much CO2 can we put in the atmosphere without risking pushing us into runaway global warming. Now, Andrew's put up a lot of slides on this. Another way of looking at it was the report from World Energy Outlook from the International Energy Agency. It said and the same figure is used for those of you who see Age of Stupid. There's an interview with a scientist who says, right, 2016, we must ensure that no later than 2016, global emissions of greenhouse gases stop rising and start coming down. And where we must end up by 2050 or somewhat beyond is a complete shift away from reliance on fossil fuels. Now, showing that we must ensure that greenhouse gas levels stop rising by 2016 only further reinforces why Copenhagen is a deadline. We must ensure that the agreements negotiated in Copenhagen get back to capitals, get ratified, so there are political delays in having an agreement ready for January 1, 2013. But we also have to retool our economies, and as Guy has pointed out, if Guy can't convince people that this is an exciting, happy, glorious opportunity to shift our economy to ways of fueling our economy, keeping our homes warmer or cooler, lighting up the places that we need lit in ways that don't threaten the future of human civilization. If that isn't good news, that we can actually have all the technology we need to make this shift, that we have every possibility of having cleaner air in our cities, more fast and reliable ways of getting around, and do it with renewable energy that doesn't create toxic effluents or long-lived nuclear radioactive waste. We have everything we need to turn away from technologies for an energy future that involves threatening the future of human civilization. So, given that that's our choice, it's astonishing that here we are 21 years after the Toronto Conference on our changing atmosphere, that we find ourselves up against some of the most appalling, deliberate, willful ignorance that's ever disgraced the Canadian political stage. And I refer to Mr. Harper. Yeah. On CBC from APEC a couple nights ago saying, well, it's too early to imagine we could actually have a treaty coming out of Copenhagen. What we need first is some sort of framework agreement, like the one we negotiated in 1992, perhaps, in which Canada is still a legally bound party. I heard him say, well, I'm not in, until other world leaders are going. 40 world leaders are going at least. Who are the good guys? Who are pulling their weight in this negotiation? President Lula of Brazil and Nicolas Sarkozy of France this week also did a joint announcement urging world leaders to show up and pull their weight. President Lula of Brazil and President Nicolas Sarkozy of France, as leaders from the industrialized world and the developing world, said we are committed to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, and Brazil said it would take on targets. Brazil's targets are all about protecting the Amazon, because most of their emissions don't come from industry, they come from deforestation, and they're not the only country in the developing world. Back in 2005 in Montreal, it was Costa Rica and Papua New Guinea and other countries from the global south saying, help us protect our rainforests, because our rainforests are part of the solution to the climate crisis. We need help because there's a lot of illegal logging. They are prepared to work with us. Developing countries are wanting to see Kyoto extended. They're part of that movement that wants to see the treaty go forward. China has invested $600 billion in green technology, and yet Mr. Harper has the gall to say Canada won't do a thing until he sees what China's going to do. China's already made us look like the global laggards that we are because China is ahead of Canada. And that's something you don't hear on the CBC. I'm wondering what's happened. Well, I know what's happened to our news media in this country, but we are not hearing what's really going on when we hear this excuse that Mr. Harper won't go to Copenhagen because other world leaders aren't going. The world leaders are going. And some of the world leaders, I should stop for just a sec to say, and because we mentioned Bill C-311, Canada's Parliament should have passed the Climate Accountability Act by now. It puts in place the targets that we all refer to. They make sense. We should pressure every single MP to bring that bill back before the House of Commons and pass it before Copenhagen. It would take a real effort of all-party agreement, but if all parties agreed, it could happen. And because we haven't mentioned him yet tonight, I want to thank Keith Martin, was a Liberal MP from Esquimalt-Juan-de-Fuca, for voting with the NDP and the Bloc and trying to get C-311 back on the floor of the House.